in the integration process of newly arrived immigrants. And they can play a role because these rights are much broader than the rights that we usually have as nationals or as permanent residents, and such as the rights that we have under contract law, under employment law, under social security law. Fundamental rights are universally available, and they are also protected at a higher level in constitutions of a country or even in international treaties. And they are a means of defense against oppression by the state. These rights are not only rights on the side of those who are beneficiary of the rights, but they also include duties of the states towards these individuals. The states must, of course, respect these fundamental rights and freedoms, and they also imply duties on other citizens, on other individuals, because each individual must respect also the fundamental rights and duties of another individual. And it's also a task of the states to ensure that the protection at this horizontal level and between individuals will be protected, so that each individual can fully benefit from rights and freedoms. Now, rights and freedoms is a very multifaceted concept, and it is often less explicit available in social orientation programs. And it has been mentioned already, some countries have formulated or state very nice fundamental values that are deemed to be very important, in the receiving society, and are expected to be respected by newcomers. But in practice, all these values, which are often inspired by fundamental rights and freedoms, are not always included in social orientation programs. And if they are integrated in these programs, they are often presented from a top-down perspective, meaning that there is an emphasis on the duty of individuals, of the newcomers, of the immigrants, to respect these values, these rights, but with very little explanation about what the legal rights and claims can also mean for these newcomers, that they themselves are entitled to receive a certain form of respect by the host state, by the citizens in the host state. And I think that the example that was given this morning by Mr. Lerut about parents opposing immigrant children's enrollment in a school exemplifies such a situation in which respect for immigrants' fundamental rights to education by the citizens in the host society is at stake. So awareness about these fundamental rights and freedoms is something that is very important, not only to be understood, but also to be practiced and exercised by newcomers. Now, a good understanding of this concept of fundamental rights and freedoms can be beneficial for this two-way process that integration is. And they express, as I've said already, the values that are deemed fundamental in the host society and demand respect by everyone. But at the same time, they can strengthen also the individual newcomer, who can equally ask for his or her rights to be respected. Now, in this regard, it's very important to understand that fundamental rights, quite contrary to what's sometimes commonly believed, that fundamental rights are not always absolute rights. In the term that if you express, I have freedom of expression, that would mean that you can say whatever you like. There is a distinction in human rights law between absolute fundamental rights and relative fundamental rights. There are very, very few absolute fundamental rights. For instance, the prohibition of torture is an absolute fundamental right. There's never, ever a good reason to torture somebody. But the other rights, most of the other rights, if you think about freedom of expression, freedom of religion, freedom of family life, they are relative rights. That means that there is a possibility for any state to limit the exercise of these rights, on the condition, of course, that the government wants to achieve a certain higher goal, meaning that the government wants to protect, for instance, public security, public order, wants to protect the rights, wants to protect the rights of other citizens, wants to protect democracy. In those instances, there's a possibility for the limitation of the rights. And such a limitation of fundamental rights is only possible if the limitation is proportionate, which means that there should be a certain balance, a certain proportionality between the goal that the government wants to achieve on the one hand, and the impact that this will have for the individual, and a good balance has to be found. And it's a bit comparable with people coming and live in society. If you are living together, often living together also means that you're going to balance and that you are going to weigh the interests and all the elements that are important in each person's life, that you are going to weigh them against each other. Now, if you want to convey this information to newcomers, to make them also aware about this concept of fundamental rights and freedoms that they have and that can protect them, this conveyance of information will certainly strengthen newcomers. And they can call upon these rights. They will be legally, but also in practice, in a better situation. For instance, the prohibition of discrimination, and closely related thereto the ban of racism, are important for newcomers. But at the same time, if you explain this complex story about rights not being absolute but relative, it may also convey the message that rights and freedoms are not unlimited, and that you cannot ask anything you like personally, but that there can also be limitations toward that. For instance, it's not because there's a difference in treatment among people that this is necessarily a discrimination if there are good reasons for that. If you want to be employed as a doctor, it's not a strange requirement that you need to have a diploma of a medical doctor before you can get employed. And that's a difference in treatment. I would like to be a doctor. I'll never be one because I don't have a medical doctorate. Fortunate for the patients also, I think. Now, on the other hand, the host society, and there we come in this two-way process, also the host society must acknowledge that it cannot limit newcomers' rights and freedoms without good reasons for higher interests. And the parents opposing that immigrant children be enrolled in school must understand that they don't have probably good reasons to demand that these children cannot be enrolled. There's no higher perspective or purpose for such a reason. So also for the host society, this knowledge about rights is important. Now, going back to social orientation, the question then becomes, how are we going to convey this information through the social orientation program? This can happen explicitly, and we have found examples where in the orientation courses sessions have been included on these rights. But it is equally feasible to do or to talk about fundamental rights when dealing with completely other issues on social orientation. For instance, if you're going to talk about waste selection and collection, it is possible to connect that to elements of mutual respect, to respect for the property of another person, to respect for the environmental, which is also one of the fundamental rights. So that's an interesting path also to take these rights in other aspects of social orientation. And it's also very much possible to do it in language courses. What you see in all social orientation programs is there is a core element of language courses, and it is possible to use human rights teams also in the instruction of language, and you can also talk about that in these language courses. And if you want to talk about housing, you can talk about discrimination on the housing market and make the connection to fundamental rights. In addition to that, more classical classroom situation, you can also think about trips, organizing trips to, for instance, specialized agencies, an ombudsperson, a human rights agency, local police office could be possible, but also in museums, you can find connections to talk about fundamental rights. So there are plenty of possibilities to engage in such rights instruction in a formal and in a less formal way. Now, nevertheless, if you want to do that, there are a number of challenges. First challenge, and it has already been indicated this morning, first challenge is that instructors are not necessarily specialists in the field of human rights and need training and information themselves. On this human rights, it's a very difficult concept. You can study 5 years in law school about it and not know everything about it. So if you want to convey that, you need good information about that. The second challenge is language. And the level of language instruction does not easily allow for communication on often very abstract themes of law, of human rights law, and it has been indicated that sometimes in some languages even the words do not exist to grasp certain concepts. So that is certainly also a challenge. There's the stubborn perception about the concept and scope of rights. Has already been indicated, I think Els hinted at that, and this idea that, for instance, certain groups in society are always racist or are always discriminatory, and also what constitutes discrimination. It's sometimes very difficult to understand what exactly this legal concept means, and that a feeling of treatment is not necessarily the same with what a legal form of discrimination would mean. On the other hand, it can also be that people think that nothing is wrong while they are being discriminated. So perceptions and overcome wrong perceptions is an important issue. And if human rights instruction is actually programmed in courses in a formal way, it's also very important to see to it that they are actually being implemented. We've seen instances in which, for instance, equality between men and women or issues on free choice of private life in terms of, for instance, homosexual relationships, that they are not being talked about by the instructors, because some of the groups will probably oppose that. So the implementation might sometimes be lacking. You should monitor that as well. Now, to achieve all that, probably the best approach is a combination of several approaches. And the classical approach by instructing it in orientation classes, and by outreach, by information sessions, by educational packages, by interactive teaching methods, instructions, by mentoring, talking together with locals, and that may all be techniques. And I think in the following presentations we'll have some very good examples of techniques actually being used to convey that message. I thank you.